I'm Vail Rumlin, the Communications Director for Sound Rivers. Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to our first Tell Me About It Tuesday of 2022. I'd like to introduce tonight's guest, Dr. Rachel Noble. Dr. Noble is a distinguished professor of the University of North Carolina's Institute of Marine Sciences. Her laboratory conducts research in the areas of public health, water quality, shellfish harvesting, and land water infrastructure science, which entails working with a diverse group of clients, from federal agencies such as the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, to metropolitan sanitation districts, municipalities, industry partners, ports, and aquaculture entities. Tonight, Dr. Noble will be talking about North Carolina's complicated relationship with stormwater. Welcome, Dr. Noble, and I'm going to share my screen now.
Great, thank you, Vail. I hope everyone is doing well this evening. I wanted to tell you a little bit today about some of our work with stormwater in Eastern North Carolina primarily, but we have conducted work in a number of other states as well. So I'll be focusing tonight because it's kind of a locals talk on Eastern North Carolina, but we've been conducting work also in Virginia, in Washington, D.C., also in California for actually some time. So next slide, Vail. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to review just really briefly what stormwater is. Just, I'm sure as North Carolinians, everyone here is familiar with stormwater, especially if you have been through hurricanes and tropical storms and nor'easters. So in North Carolina, when we talk about stormwater, we talk about storms of varying, as you all know, of varying intensities and varying durations. Sometimes we'll get a sprinkling event that lasts for 3, 4, 5 days. And sometimes a tropical storm or hurricane will cause us to receive upwards of 1 meter of precipitation over a very short window of time. So one of the points about water quality here in North Carolina is that it's unpredictable. And we have issues related to stormwater that are due to the fact that our stormwater runoff is unpredictable. You can see here a photo of the town of Beaufort. Some of you might be familiar with it, right along the coast here. Yep. It's where I live. Is it possible for someone to mute their mic? Anyway, so in the town of Beaufort, we can actually see here, this water that you're seeing the truck up on the upper right drive through, it's actually salt water, if you can believe it. This is water that's actually come up from the stormwater system through the pipes and out into the street during a king tide. And for those of you who live along the coast or who have been to the coast and been visiting or possibly have places along the coast, you realize that we're seeing these events more often, and we're actually seeing them to be more serious in magnitude than previous events. And I'll talk a little bit about that for a second. So remember, even though I have a slide here that says, what is stormwater? We have a situation where the stormwater delivery is complicated by the fact that the tide is actually pushing water up the stormwater system rather than allowing the water to pass through the stormwater system, which is how it was designed. So stormwater in North Carolina is actually the main reason for a lot of our beach advisories and our shellfish closures. What happens in North Carolina is that our wastewater infrastructure, our sewage treatment plants, and most septic systems, not all, actually work quite well. But what we do have a problem with is contamination that stems from stormwater. Here you can see a little diagram that depicts stormwater runoff. And I like this diagram because it shows that stormwater runoff can contain contaminants that are coming from a myriad of sources. So we have sources that can come from houses themselves, represented by oils and grease and industrial and residential chemicals. We have yard runoff. We can have storm drain materials that flow off of roadways and come through the storm system. And remember, we can also have the very pipes that are depicted in the front where storm water is passing through the system But when those pipes are actually cracked or compromised, the stormwater system is not working as it was designed. Next slide, please. So this is really the maybe environmental sciences 101 part of my talk. I want to remind everyone that in a situation that North Carolina may have been in maybe 100 or 200 years ago, where it was largely undeveloped, particularly along the central and eastern parts of North Carolina, that we had a lot of opportunity for stormwater to soak into the land, as you see depicted by the diagram on the upper left. What this basically shows you is that when it rains, only a small portion of the material runs off into the receiving waters, like a creek, a river, or an estuary, or or beach at the coast. This also depicts that you get infiltration, which basically means that the water that's falling from the sky basically soaks into the land, and a part of that water actually makes it down into the deeper water, so potentially makes it into the groundwater. If you shift your attention to a situation along the bottom where you increase the rate of development and increase the amount of impervious surface in any given space, so by that I mean roads, buildings, parking lots, box stores, any kind of situation where you've created an impermeable surface where there once was vegetated land, you can basically see that you are reducing the amount of material that can soak into the land, and you're increasing the amount of water that flows into the waterways. This is not rocket science, but somehow this combines with the fact that in North Carolina, we have a very flat landscape, means that the stormwater runoff actually is not allowing the material to transport.
No, because I don't have it on it.
If you could go to the next slide, Bill. So the next is a diagram that basically shows you the receiving waters. On the receiving water end, where previously I showed you a diagram that showed you the sources of contamination that can come from stormwater. When we think about a watershed perspective, we remind ourselves that the very stormwater runoff that's coming into the ocean and into the estuary has more than one pathway to impact human health. It can do so by actually causing agriculture and livestock runoff to overflow, causing animal waste to flow into rivers and estuaries. You might be familiar with hog lagoon breaches that have occurred previously during storms in North Carolina, also with poultry farms, not to implicate hogs unfairly. Urban runoff contains excess nitrogen and phosphorus, can also contain a range of pathogens. And then you have situations where that material can get into the estuarine system and not only cause illness if you're exposed to the water, but can actually cause algal blooms that they themselves can produce toxins, and a lack of oxygen in the water, which actually impacts the fish species and can negatively impact the ecosystem. Next slide, please. You can go ahead and press that again. I'm sorry for the animation. So when we think about stormwater runoff, and I'll just be brief with that, Vail, you don't have to go back because it's having problems loading. You can see that actually on the photos that I showed very briefly there, that there are multiple ways that stormwater can be delivered to locations that humans come in contact with it. So before I get into the details of some of the work that we've done in Eastern North Carolina, I want to remind everyone about the fact that there's water under the land where you are. And that water actually is found either as a deep groundwater, what's also known as your aquifer or your drinking water, or your surficial groundwater, which is just in a lot of locations in Eastern North Carolina. If you dig a hole in your yard, you'll hit the surficial groundwater in just a few feet of digging. And so what this means is that pipes that are actually placed below the surface of the land during certain times not only have the impact of the rising tide to the side with our ocean environments, but the groundwater is actually pushing up below. So there are three reasons that North Carolina stormwater is so much different and more complicated than stormwater in most other areas along the mid-Atlantic seaboard and certainly on the West Coast. And that's because we have a shallow coastal plain and we have a very, very shallow surficial groundwater. So that sponge, if you will, that land that allows stormwater to basically soak up is very, very small. So imagine a sponge in your sink. Imagine a sponge that's a 1/4 inch thick. And imagine trying to clean up a spill maybe on your floor using that sponge. And now imagine another sponge that looks more like a car washing sponge that's maybe 4 or 5 inches thick. A 4 or 5 inch thick sponge is going to be able to soak up much, much more water. So if you go ahead and press the button there, Vale, that's going to go through an animation that basically shows you the so layer on top of that the fact that wastewater pipes and stormwater pipes are laid in parallel with each other in North Carolina systems. You can go ahead and press it again. You can see that there actually can be times when contaminated wastewater can leak out of cracked wastewater pipes. And go ahead and press it again. And during periods where the groundwater rises up, that contaminated wastewater and the stormwater pipe all become connected. This is all actually happening below the land, but many of you are probably aware that it's happening because you can smell and you can see some of these kinds of mixtures of contamination coming out in the ditches in various areas of eastern North Carolina. Next slide, please. So go ahead and press it again. I don't know why there's animation here, but this is actually one of our wastewater pipes that we've been studying in eastern North Carolina. This is the Orange Street outfall in Beaufort, North Carolina. This is right next to the Stillwater, or what's known as the Front Street Grill. They're on Front Street in Beaufort. This is basically showing you a small storm, what we consider to be a small storm in eastern North Carolina. You can actually see that the stormwater pipe is completely covered by water, by high tide water. This is not stormwater. This is the actual Taylor's Creek estuary covering the pipe. So in this particular case, if it was low tide, the stormwater would actually be flowing out of the pipe. But in this particular case, the actual tide water, the estuary water, is holding the stormwater back. And clearly that's not the optimal situation for release of the stormwater discharge, because if you were driving down Front Street in eastern North Carolina, you would want to not be driving through a foot or two of water, creating an impassable situation in your car. This also has a high impact on sewage infrastructure because salt water and terracotta pipes do not mix. So many of the pipes that are in the municipalities or towns that are found in eastern North Carolina and really actually throughout North Carolina have clay pipes that were laid in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, creating a situation where when the salt water comes into the system, it degrades every single time. It degrades the terracotta in a chronic way over decades and decades. Next slide. So you can see what a degraded pipe looks like in that last picture that just kind of was shown there. You can see that on the bottom right. And just to talk to you a little bit about stormwater, we're really concerned about making sure that people, you can go to the next slide, Pam. We're really concerned with a lot of our work. And so I wanted, in case people have to leave early from this presentation, it might seem like an odd time to be talking all of a sudden about stormwater issues and about work with schools and work with the Duke Community Science Initiative. But it's really important in eastern North Carolina for us as a community, for everyone, including students and young people across the board, to understand how stormwater works and how we can all contribute to reducing the negative impacts of stormwater. And to do that, we've actually created an app called Adopt a Drain. And if any of you are interested in learning a little bit more about this, you might be interested in adopting a storm drain in your own neighborhood or in your own town. I can share with you how to gain access to the app. We're currently trying to work with teachers across the state of North Carolina to improve the usage of the app and to get user feedback from students So we developed the idea, and it's been going over very, very well. But at the same time, we're out to get comments and feedback from people who are interested in trying to be more proactive. So it actually has a mechanism where you can adopt a drain at a specific location. You can identify what kinds of litter, plastics, trash, and debris are around the drain. You get an opportunity to clean the drain, and you get a chance to upload all of that data and to keep on continuing to adopt the drain over time. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the scope of the problem in North Carolina, I just want to make it clear what we look like in terms of urbanization as related to our inland counties. So many of you know that North Carolina has been growing population-wise for some time and is one of the most rapidly growing states in the country. When you think about the coastal shoreline counties, we have an incredible increase in the amount of people that are, increasing the urbanization in the coastal counties. Next slide, please. So when you talk about the North Carolina coastal plain, also we think about elevation. We think about the fact that we can go all the way past New Bern, North Carolina, when here in Beaufort, North Carolina, we can drive all the way inland and we can still not go but a few meters in elevation by driving all that way. So this area of North Carolina is the third largest low-lying region in the United States. We are tracking sea level rise in these areas of North Carolina, and many of you have seen the impacts of that on the marshes and wetland environments over time. And we are expecting the population to grow 26% within the next decade. Next slide, please. So let's talk just a little bit about wastewater and stormwater, because it's a little bit confusing. Wastewater, if you all live in an area that's a municipality that's served by a sewage treatment system, whenever you flush the toilet, you are actually contributing that material directly by gravity and then by pumping to a central, which is called a centralized waste treatment system, a central sewage treatment plant. That material also is going to receive gray water that includes all of the water from your houses, including washing machine, dishwasher, anything that goes down the sink. And all of that material goes into the waste treatment plant and is put through a series of treatment steps. It's disinfected with something like a chlorine or a bromine mixture. That disinfecting is kind of reversed to remove the lots of chlorine in the water as it comes out as effluent. And that material is discharged into either a river, stream, or an estuary along the North Carolina coast. In the state of North Carolina, we don't have ocean outfalls. So there is no place in North Carolina where a pipe sticks out into technically the ocean, but we do have a lot of discharges that are in our estuaries. Stormwater, on the other hand, is from a variety of sources, like I showed you before. Anything that's coming across the land can then flow into curbs, like grates in curbs and gutters, goes down into a stormwater pipe and is simply transported by gravity out to the closest receiving water body. And by that, I mean, once again, creek, river, estuary, or beach. Next slide, please. So when we think about the public health and economic significance, of course, all of that water flows downhill. So we in Eastern North Carolina are the recipients of our own stormwater runoff. But I think many of you could see during Hurricane Florence and Hurricanes Matthew that we actually were the recipients of flow that came down the rivers from our major cities, such as Raleigh. So we were actually experiencing the flow from through the Neuse River estuary and the Albemarle and Pamlico rivers for months after Hurricane Florence, if you can believe it. The estimated annual economic burden of stormwater is $2.9 million. So there's not a great system for cleaning up or managing stormwater, although US EPA does take a stab at it. Next slide, please. So we actually recently completed some work that I'm going to tell you just a little bit about today, where we tried to untangle this situation where we wanted to study stormwater runoff, but we wanted to understand whether or not tide was having a significant impact on the distribution or the discharge, of the stormwater runoff. You can see that the tide, just from that one picture of the stormwater pipe being inundated, you can see that the tide does have an impact, but we wanted to do this in a quantitative way. First of all, we wanted to do it because it's never been done before, if you can believe it. There has been no study that we can find on stormwater that incorporated tidal inundation. And you and we all know that this is something that has been of increasing concern for the last decade and longer. So it's surprising to me that there's not more information out there. We also know that we can't actually manage our stormwater whenever it rains, if that stormwater doesn't flow out to the creeks and rivers and estuaries where it was designed to go. We don't have any engineering solutions in North Carolina that allow us to capture all of that water because the actual volume of water is just too great. Next slide, please. So what we decided to do was we wanted to try to understand the impact of the semi-diurnal slide as tides. And we did all of this work in Taylor's Creek because it was proximal to what most of you may know as the Rachel Carson Reserve, which is a part of the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. And it's a very, very important reserve to the people of North Carolina. Next slide. So in Beaufort, North Carolina, I don't know, I guess I can't actually show you my cursor, so I'm just going to have to describe it. The long, skinny body of water that's sandwiched in between what looks like an island and what looks like a mainland area, which is downtown Beaufort, is Taylor's Creek. There are two outfalls that we studied that are right on Taylor's Creek. Those are right in downtown Beaufort. The green one is the Orange Street outfall that I showed you a picture of. The blue one is the Marsh Pollock outfall that actually has a more serious problem with saltwater. If you can believe it, it's even worse than the Orange Street outfall. And Ann Street was an outfall that we decided to work on because we truly wanted to understand how much of the saltwater was persisting up the stormwater pipes and into the town of Beaufort. So this is one block in. So at least 200 meters or 275 meters away from the water. So let's talk about these a little bit. Next slide. So I promise that there won't be very many graphs in this particular presentation, but I do want to call your attention to, you don't even have to pay attention to the numbers on the left-hand side that show you the level of the water being depicted. So the blue lines, you guessed it, those are tide. So the tide goes up, the tide comes down, and it continues to happen on a regular basis. Sometimes our high tide is higher than other times. But still we have a high tide and low tide, and typically we have 2 of those per day. What this graphic is actually showing you is that in a stormwater pipe, you can actually see in the orange, you can see the fact that there's a storm brewing. All of a sudden, the storm is actually coming along, and the velocity of the water stays at about 0. So the velocity is on the right-hand side of the slide. That's velocity in meters per second. So just imagine a grapefruit moving along the pipe at a meter per second, which is pretty fast. And then imagine a situation where all of a sudden it gets to be high tide, and that date that's about August 8th, 2017, it shifts to low tide. And you can see that during the storm, that stormwater is released. Then it becomes high tide again, and that water is held back. And then the water actually from the tide shifts downward again to low tide, allowing the water to kind of come out of these pipes. I labeled this as a perfect world, but it's not really a perfect world. It's the issue is that we want people to understand that our stormwater is being delivered to our estuary there only during periods whenever it's the low tide that's allowing that water to come through. Next slide, please. In reality, now that you've seen kind of a one diagram, we actually have a situation where you don't have to pay too much attention to this, other than it's also showing you level on the right-hand side now and discharge on the left-hand side, although the units are slightly different for the discharge. That's cubic meters now per half hour, so a cubic meter per 30 minutes. And basically the point that you see here is that the variability in stormwater discharge coming out the pipe is extremely high. And so if any of you ever thought that you understood what a hydrograph looks like from previous presentations, you can say that this hydrograph in Eastern North Carolina doesn't look anything like what many of us learned about if we took an environmental science class. Next slide, please. So what this basically is telling you is that during a rain event, you have a stormwater pipe that has water in it. The stormwater pipe is engineered to deliver that water under by traveling under the surface of the land through a pipe and out into an estuary, river, or creek. What actually happens is that during high tide, that stormwater is held back, and during low tide, that water is released. Next slide, please. This seems pretty simple, but no one had really validated the importance of tide on stormwater previously, as I said. So I had a graduate student who decided to conduct his sampling, and what he did, instead of just going out during wet and dry periods to characterize the stormwater, is he attended to sampling during times whenever the tide was high, meaning that the system was inundated, when the tide was at the mid-tide level, which is referred to in this particular study as a transition period. So anywhere between 2 and 4 hours away from low or high tide, just right in between, or at low tide, which is the receding condition, which means that the water was at its lowest point. Next slide. So what we did at first was we sampled in all 3 locations. These 3 rings are basically showing you that the study was conducted in a way where my student did a really good job of sampling during all different types of conditions. He sampled at the 3 different locations shown in the red by Ann Street, the blue on the outside by Marsh Pollock, and the greenish kind of putty color on the Orange Street on the outside. He also studied, he also sampled over valuable time periods for tide, like I just described, for inundated, transition, and receding, doing each of those about 30%. So what this means is that he didn't devote a lot of attention, say, to the receding condition, you know, and ignore the inundated. He really nicely covered this. And then he also covered both wet weather and dry weather. So let's see how things turned out a bit. Next slide. So the bottom line is that in Eastern North Carolina, the stormwater is contaminated. The stormwater was more contaminated on the right, as you can see the higher concentrations at Ann Street. And you don't really have to pay so much attention to the numbers. You can just see that the red bars are higher than the green and the blue. And guess why they're higher? They're higher because it's inland and because the system is not diluted as much by salt water. Ann Street actually isn't higher, just because it's more contaminated. It's that salt water is actually coming into the system at Orange Street and Marsh Pollock because they're right along the estuary there. Next slide. So when we think about the tide, the bottom line or the punch line is that during the receding condition, the water quality was actually there was higher concentrations of markers that we associate with contamination. So things like viruses and bacteria that can cause you to be ill. And during inundated conditions, meaning high tide, whenever that water is coming up into the stormwater pipe, the concentrations were lower because the stormwater was actually becoming diluted with the salt water. So what does this mean? This means that whenever we think about monitoring programs that are being conducted in Eastern North Carolina, that are conducted without paying attention to tide, that sometimes they might be actually portraying the stormwater quality to be better than it really is, because they are measuring contaminants that have been diluted by salt water. This also shows you that monitoring programs that take a look at stormwater, especially in Eastern North Carolina, where it's so flat, and that they only think about storms and dry weather, and they don't think at all about tide, that we're making a mistake because we're not understanding the system and how it's really working. So we need to include tidal parameters in order to make progress to know what we can do about the stormwater runoff and the contaminants coming into the system. Next slide. So I wanted to show you a little bit today about something pretty exciting that we've been working on with Duke University Marine Lab. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and tell you about an autonomous boat that we've been using to study water quality in some of the areas around the town of Beaufort. We identified that the Orange Street outfall that I showed you that was inundated with stormwater, that was actually severely compromised because of the corrosion that was occurring due to salt water. We succeeded in helping the town of Beaufort actually get money to remediate that pipe, and it's now PVC. So it's not being impacted as badly by salt water because it's no longer made out of terracotta. We've also been trying to work a little bit more on illicit dumping from boats, which is another source of contamination. And I have a study being led by an undergraduate student, Jenna Hines, where she's doing work in the Town Creek estuary. And we really are working actively with a number of towns along the eastern coast of North Carolina to try to understand what are some of our engineering solutions, what are the possibilities? What do we do? It's hard to hold back the ocean, as many of you know from experiencing hurricanes and tropical storms. Next slide. So here's a picture of the first run of our autonomous boat. It wasn't so autonomous because you had to sit in it and you had to drive it. Nonetheless, it was designed by a robotics expert, Rhett Newton, who's a graduate student at Duke University Marine Lab. And some of you might actually know Rhett because he actually was recently the mayor of Beaufort, but he's just recently given up that post to Sharon Harker. If you'd go to the next slide, Bill. So what we actually have been able to do is to use these autonomous systems to track things like turbidity in Town Creek. So we can take an entire estuary where previously, if you sent a student out, they might have to take a water sample, bring it back to the laboratory, and analyze the samples one by one to create maybe a little bit of information about the estuary itself. Now you can see that by using the autonomous boat, we can go back and forth across the estuary using these transects, just almost as if you're making a square across the estuary, and you can measure turbidity and you can create a contour map of the turbidity. This is really, really useful because we know that after hurricanes and tropical storms, that people don't largely want to be in the water, but we still have chemical spills and sewage spills that we want to be able to characterize. And that's what we hope to be able to do with this technology. Next slide. Vale, that should actually be a video, I'm hoping. So this is the second iteration. This is Autonomous Boat 2.0. I think you'll notice it's much smaller. We were able to compact the size. It can actually be used to track dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll A, temperature, salinity, and turbidity. It also can be used and it can be programmed to basically go anywhere you want. So you can track the water quality in a shellfish bed, like an oyster bed. You can track it in an estuary, and you can track it in some of the most difficult environments in an estuary. Furthermore, what we're trying to do is we're trying to arm the system with hyperspectral cameras that allow us to understand something about the temperature of the water and some of the other characteristics of cameras that allow us to potentially detect different types of contaminants, such as detergents, optical brighteners, and microbial and chemical contaminants. Next slide. So we have a lot of collaborators that have worked on these multiple projects that we've conducted in Eastern North Carolina. A lot of people to thank. I am certain that there are people that are not on this list. We have a lot to thank for the town of Beaufort to be so proactive and allowing us to really use them as a test bed to conduct a lot of our research. And I'll go ahead and take any questions that you all may have because I know I covered a lot of ground there.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Noble? You can put them in the chat.
I want to make sure that everybody knows You can't see because I'm wearing my jacket here, but I've got this screen behind me that I'm actually at UNC Chapel Hill. I work at Carolina, but I do collaborate with Duke on the community science initiative work. So if you need to get in touch with me, you're welcome to write me an email directly to my UNC email address. And if you'd like to contact me regarding some of the teaching work that we're doing with Duke, I'd be happy to also put you in touch with them. Anyone have any questions?
Dr. Nabel, I have a question to start. This is Heather. And the one study that you talked about was it several $1 billion worth of costs related to stormwater. Now, is that a national study or was that one just associated with the state of North Carolina?
That is a national study, and that studied the economic burden of viral and bacterial infections. So imagine going for a swim, maybe at the beach during a period of time where you it's just been an afternoon thunderstorm. You've gone swimming in some contaminated water. You end up getting sick. But there's actually a secondary, well, everybody knows now, I don't have to explain this. With COVID, I always forget how much we all have learned. But there's a whole train of secondary infection that occurs when you come back into your condo, and now it can have the potential to share a lot of those infections with other people through norovirus, which many of you are familiar with, or other viruses. And so what that study did was it looked at the amount of money that was lost, not only to the medical costs associated with being sick, but also lost days of work, and then impacts on family members or maybe workmates, and created a model to understand what the impact was. But it did use data from the Eastern Seaboard, so from North Carolina, Virginia. For those of you that don't know, we're actually 5th in the country in beach tourism. So we have a pretty high level beach tourism numbers here in North Carolina. So we have a lot of people that are getting impacted each year during periods of contamination. We're only behind Texas, California, Hawaii, and Virginia. I'm sorry, and Florida. So we, you know, when you think of the big beach tourism, we certainly are right up there as far as the along the country.
We do have another question for you from Stephen Moisey. What are the implications of the tide effect for microbial loading? Will the total loads from a storm still be the same, just delayed in time?
That is a great question. And my graduate student actually spent 2 years of his work trying to create a dispersion model that took into account not only the patterns of stormwater loading and delivery out, but also took into account the flows coming into the system, diluting, adding volume, and then still it ends up coming back out during low tide. The answer to your question is that we don't know. The reason why we believe that loading is even greater than it normally would be is because wind also often plays a role in the amount of water that comes into the system. And what happens is that wastewater and stormwater systems are not functioning the way that they were designed because they've been impacted by the tide water that's coming in to the landscape. And so the issue is that the wastewater systems go into a mode where they're on overflow. And when the wastewater system goes into an overflow, and you can look at this by looking at the publicly available data for the wastewater discharge values, and basically look at it during a storm and not during a storm. And what you see is that the system is not working properly during storm events because the material is flying through the system too quickly because it goes into an overflow status. So the answer to your question is that it's either equal or greater. It's certainly the load is not less, but it's very, very difficult to get a handle, as you can imagine, because of the type of storm, the impact of groundwater, the impact of wastewater, and then wind-driven tidal fluctuations. And so all of that make it so that it is well beyond my mathematical capabilities. And I hope someone will take it on in the near future. We actually have a collaborator that's been interested in this, but it just hasn't been done yet. But it's a great question.
Okay, we have another one. Have you studied the potential positive impact of green stormwater infrastructure on bacteria/pollutant discharges?
I have quite a bit. So one of the issues is that some of those systems, some of them are stormwater retention ponds, either wet or dry. Some of them can be constructed wetlands. There are various different types of retention systems. Some of them are smaller scale, like rain gardens and swales. And the bottom line is that these things generally do a good job of capturing small amounts of stormwater whenever rainfall is occurring in a situation like a more of a drizzle type storm, where the intensity of the storm is not so great, and where the water has a chance to basically soak into the landscape. Most of these systems work well for managing nitrogen and phosphorus, and many of them work well for capturing sediments. Like a stormwater pond will do a really good job of capturing the water and then allowing it to sit there so that the sediment basically drops out and allows the stormwater pond to just be kind of mucky at the bottom. Most of these systems actually don't do a very good job of degrading the viruses and bacteria that come into the system. And so you kind of get a win on one side. And unfortunately, for some bacteria, they can actually grow in these systems, making a situation where you can actually show a reduction in nutrient concentrations on the one side. And then on the other side, you actually show that you're creating more bacteria and creating more of a problem, because it's like a culture. It's like a big culture bottle sitting in the laboratory. The bacteria just love the organic matter and they love the warm water in the summertime. So the other thing is that whenever we have storms that move faster and that are higher intensity, most of these systems just simply don't capture the water because the water flows over them too quickly and the water's not captured, and that still actually flows into the receiving water environment unchecked. And so they'll capture a little bit of the water, but as was just asked about, when you really think about the loading, you're talking about just unfortunately a small reduction in the total volume of water that's going out to the ocean or estuary. Some of our smaller storms, we see 10 to the 15th viruses and bacteria over a single storm coming into the coastal waters of North Carolina. Just think about the number of 10 to the 15th. That's a 1 with 15 zeros after it. Those are the bacteria and viruses that are being carried by a single storm coming out into the estuary. So you can see that the math, we've been operating on the idea that dilution is going to work. And that's getting to be less and less true as we are dealing with these huge volumes of stormwater.
Okay, we have another question from Catherine Castleman. Can you talk a little bit more about the EPA regulatory framework for stormwater? What opportunities might exist within that framework for advancing better policies in our state?
That's another really good question. So most of you already know the EPA hands down recommendations across the country, and states implement those recommendations. Some states do a really good job of implementing those regulations plus some. Some states do just what they can to get by, to still get federal monies that allow them to support their water quality programs. And some states actually choose not to listen to EPA at all and do something completely different. We're one of the states that is about in the middle. We're not particularly extra proactive. So the state of Washington on the West Coast and the state of California are good examples of extremely proactive locations that devote a lot of attention to their stormwater reduction policies. And they do that because just in, say, one of the bays, the Santa Monica Bay that leads out to the beach waters of Los Angeles, they get almost 185 million visitors a year. So if you have a solid amount of time that's actually a situation where the beaches are closed, it impacts a lot of people, even if your advisories are only 1% of the time. In North Carolina, we do a pretty good job of doing great monitoring along the coastline, but we don't do a good job in enforcing any of our stormwater rules. So repeat offenders remain repeat offenders. I would love to see where we are actually conducting more work during poor weather. Most of the monitoring that's conducted along the East Coast, and that includes North Carolina, but also Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, almost all of it is done during good weather. And they just don't go out and collect samples whenever it's nasty out. They don't do that because it can be dangerous, but they also don't do it because it characterizes periods of time that are a different scenario. So I'd love to see a random sampling program where you just can't avoid it. You have a specific site and it gets sampled around the clock, regardless of the condition. And in North Carolina, they do a pretty good job of that, but certainly there are periods of time whenever the water's just, there's just a big storm and they don't actually do the sampling. So we're right about in the middle. I'd like to see, I would hope that we are beginning to improve a bit. Where I believe, and I'll keep this short, where I think we're gonna improve is North Carolina is really beginning to take off in regards to aquaculture. All different types of aquaculture, but certainly oysters. And we can't be a leader in shellfish production and let our stormwater run rampant. We just can't, because the water bodies will be closed where we're trying to harvest food from. So the stuff will hit the fan more in terms of enforcement once we're actually trying to create an economic benefit from another product in North Carolina, once we have a market for showing that there's a monetary benefit to increasing our mitigation of stormwater contaminants. So that's a really, really good question.
We have one more question. We hear of reports of Vibrio infections from time to time, especially post-hurricanes. Is the risk likely to get worse with climate change?
Yes, my lab has actually done a lot of work in that area. Vibrios are not really related to stormwater, although they can respond to storm conditions like you noted in hurricanes. Vibrio bacteria are found ubiquitously in North Carolina waters all of the time. And the ones that actually cause wound infections and gastrointestinal upset are here. If you take a sample of an oyster, you're going to find them. They love warm water, so climate change is definitely impacting Vibrio pathogens because it's increasing the incidence of infection in humans. We also have a situation where, everyone wants to be at the beach and everyone now wants to eat seafood because it's healthy, even though an oyster po' boy might not be the healthiest thing you can eat. Everybody's kind of convinced that all types of seafood, including shellfish, are really good things to consume. So we have a situation where they are increasing. And in particular, I would just acknowledge that during hurricanes and tropical storms, and certainly during summer wet conditions, to be careful with floodwaters and be careful with brackish waters, because they can contain levels of pathogens that can actually cause wound infections, and those wound infections can be quite serious. But we've been doing this kind of work for about 15 or 20 years, and we can show you that the patterns of the Vibrios are increasing. When I arrived here to North Carolina in the wintertime, Vibrios would be almost non-existent because they would die in the cold water. Our waters generally, even though most people might think it's cold outside right now, at this moment, but our waters actually have been warming to the extent where we always have Vibrios we always have measurable Vibrios in our estuaries, no matter what time of year I look. We don't have zeros anymore. And so everything has continued to scale up by 10-fold, 100-fold as we continue to go on. So it's a serious issue.
Okay, thank you. And we do have one more question. Lori Gaskins had a question. She's having trouble navigating the Adopt a Drain website.
So I think I actually have to give you all a new link. Is there somewhere that I can provide it later, Vale? Because we do have a new site that we're using in Qualtrics for the Adopt a Drain.
Okay, we can send it out to all of our to all of the people who registered for the show. we can certainly
That
do
would be great. If you could just remind me, maybe tomorrow, I'll go ahead and dig up the link for you so that people can use it.
Okay, great. So Lori, we'll have a link for you to use tomorrow. All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up unless we have any last questions. Okay.
Anyone? All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Couple of more things we have. Thank you again, Dr. Noble. Next
Thank you.
month, we have another Tell Me About It Tuesday. This one's going to be on February 8th, I believe. We're going to host Dr. Barbara Dahl, and she's going to talk about natural systems, improving resilience to coastal riverine flooding. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. And again, thank our guest, Dr. Rachel Noble.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.